how can emotional intelligence help you in a highly stressful situation? And one example that comes to mind is active shooter, right? Active shooter response, historically, we really didn't start training that until 1999 after Columbine. The tactic that at that time was surround and call out. And then after analyzing why law enforcement does that, we found that, we're not going to save the hostages by just doing a surround and call out in that situation. So we developed this active shooter response tactics to respond to these types of critical incidents, right? And specifically, I have been involved in an active shooter at a Walmart years ago. And so, thinking about our response to that, it's all, we rely on our training, right? One technique that we often refer to in this active shooter response is we go through the structure, we locate and stop the threat to any innocence, right? That technique involves, moving at a hurried pace to engage the suspect, stop the threat, move just as fast as you can accurately think and accurately shoot, right? So now as cops, we focus on the shooting part because everyone in training sees how well we shoot or we don't shoot. But nobody, by the way, historically, law enforcement has very poor hit percentage rate when it comes to suspects. But so we work on that stuff on the range, right? Our shooting techniques can be improved through training, improved marksmanship and range training, right? But usually, when poor decisions are made in law enforcement, we redo the scenario, we change up the decision based upon our previous experience. Well, in real life, it's a pass-fail situation, right? If we're actively under fire or someone's actively killing someone, our decisions are life and death, right? So this brings a high amount of stress upon us, right? But here's the thing: in training, the one thing nobody's looking at or no one can see are the factors on how I made my decision, right? It's either a bad decision or a good decision. So that's where EI skills come into play, learning how to manage that stress, whether it's breathing technique or just knowing the neuroscience about why you're thinking, right? Understanding the neuroscience about the amygdala hijacked, right? Why you're emotionally compromised, why this stress is making you emotionally compromised, right? And this really affects your decision making under stress, right? And that's why, we used to say in the Marine Corps, having a brain fart, right? Because we're just overwhelmed with the stress, right? And there's the science behind it. And Parrish will tell you that our thinking when we're emotionally compromised, our IQ gets impaired, right? There's documented evidence, we can operate under 10 to 15 less IQ points because we're emotionally compromised, right? And the neuroscience, there's the emotional part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex, which is the critical thinking part of your brain. And knowing this stuff through EI skills helps your decision making, the problem solving. And that's what cops are. We're problem solvers, right? And knowing this is half the battle. A lot of cops just don't know this and how to regulate that. And having sit through some of Parrish's training, I can tell you it's going to be effective. It brings out those points. Anytime we have these strong emotions of stress or anxiety or anger or even joy, it can impair the emotional response and how you respond to something, right? So it's a very powerful thing. It overwhelms our rationality. And so, the better our training is in EI skills and even in the technical of active shooter response, the better we're going to act, right? If you think about how stressful active shooter situation is, if you look at all the active shooter events that have happened, you've got sirens going on, you got if there's a fire going on in the school, you've got yelling and screaming, you've got people injured, right? And so the more that we can do the real life training event, the more our training kicks in, right? But when you talk about human performance in that situation, you'll see a lot of things happen to people that if they're not in that flow state where they're actively able to think and problem solve it under that stress, and they don't revert to that training, they will fail. They'll fail in the performance. There's a famous quote from Archelaus, the Greek philosopher, that talks about, the expectation is that we will rise to the level of the event, but in reality, we will fall to the level of our training, right? So if you think about the actual active shooter training, and then you talk about the human performance of emotional intelligence skills and the neuroscience and learning this stuff, it's going to make you a more competent officer, a more competent leader, right? And then not even any active shooter scene, just any kind of major traffic accident where you've got a lot of casualties and things are very chaotic, right? And you have these competing interests at play, and you think about a new supervisor becomes very overwhelmed versus the crusty old sergeant that's been there 30, 40 years that has all this knowledge and experience, right? And they've been in that situation. They know how to handle themselves, right? That's part of, on the job training of emotional intelligence that they've gleaned over the lifetime of experience, right? That's why it's important at critical incidents to prioritize missions, tasks, take the most important things first, and then delegate. The NTOA came up with the safety priorities to help you with the decision-making process, right? And then, we're a big proponent on learning these emotional intelligence skills, because when it comes to problem solving and critical decision-making, it helps you make better decisions, right? There's a physical part of it. There's a psychological part of it, right? The stressors and the cognition of competing resources, competing decisions you have to make in a stressful event. How do you pick one life over another? You have these gunshot victims. You've got innocent people that are still being killed in an active shooter situation. We're trained to respond and stop the threat to kill them. But how do you bypass? How do you overcome that mental block to bypass injured people to get to the shooter, right? And so this is where the competitive thinking, dividing tasks between what the priority is and what the environment demands, right? I think it's, and maybe Paris is familiar with it, I'm sure, about Dr. Kahneman, about system one and system two thinking, that, we really can't multitask as a human individual, right? Because we can only think at one thing at a time, but our brain does a really good job about moving between system one and system two back and forth, which thinks that we can multitask when really our brain can only focus on one thing at a time, right? And so when you think about active shooter and you've got injured but you still have active threat, overcoming that task demand versus your environment, to stop the killing, to stop the suspect, in that stressful situation, right? And so one thing that we've always taught from the time that I was in the military, the Marine Corps, and which transferred over to law enforcement, is, that combat breathing technique, getting oxygen from your emotional part of your brain to your prefrontal cortex, where our problem solving part of our brain is, right? That's just the neuroscience of it. But it's a perishable skill, just like our firearms, just like our other training that we do. If we don't practice that daily breathing, we forget about it in times of crisis. And so, fortunately for us with technology, we got the Apple Watch these days. It reminds you to breathe. So that's a great benefit of technology these days. But I hope that kind of gives you a real life experience on how emotional intelligence can help you in these tactical situations.